and welcome back to the channel. I'm Muriel, and in this video I will be doing my reading wrap-up for the month of June, during which I read a total of 7 books, including 2 non-fiction books, 1 graphic novel, or rather manga, 3 novels, and 1 novella. Starting with the non-fiction, I first read the Book of Celtic Symbols, written by Joules Taylor, and I honestly don't have much to say about this one because it was one of those woo-woo, new agey publications that aim to give your life a veneer of spirituality rooted in pagan mythology and, well, neo-pagan theology, and not, as I'd hoped, a book about the semiotics of Celtic symbols. Those roots are invariably paper-thin, and most, not all, but most of the information in this book was made up or misrepresented bullshit without any kind of proper sourcing. Fine, whatever. Honestly, I should have done more research before purchasing this one, and I've already unhauled it, but that's entirely on me. Live and learn, I guess. Oh, and so it was a 3.5 to a 4 out of 10 for me, which might seem high given what I just said, but that's because, given what this book actually was, and was going for, it wasn't, offensively bad. After that objectively waste of time, I read Pagans, the Visual Culture of Pagan Myths, Legends, and Rituals, written by Ethan Doyle White. It presents a decently comprehensive and lavishly illustrated overview of pagan, or alternatively non-Abrahamic religions, past and present, through its deities, its rituals, its symbols, and broader iconography. I really appreciated the fact this, on the whole, very good reference included contemporary pagan religions derived from European traditions and history, alongside traditional religions from Africa, East Asia, and the Americas, and treated them with respect and dignity. The author also did a good job of pointing out the fact that whilst contemporary pagan practices aren't actually, for the vast majority of them, directly derived from ancient pagan practices, as pertaining to those traditions rooted in Europe's pre-Christian past, at least, this doesn't lessen their validity as legitimate religious or spiritual traditions. Where contemporary paganism does, in fact, overlap with historical reconstructionism and actual historical tradition, this was pointed out as well, to some extent. I did, unfortunately, spot an actual mistake in the text. I think it had to do with the cult of Vesta in ancient Rome, perhaps an oversight on the editor's part, and a couple of points here and there lacked some nuance. It's also not the most thorough text you'll encounter on the subject of ancient and contemporary pagan, or earth-centered, or non-Abrahamic religions. There is apparently controversy surrounding the usage of the term pagan when it comes to those religions, so use the one you prefer. But it really is a very nice 8 out of 10 visual reference on the topic, and I'm glad I not only read it, but have a copy of it to store in my nonfiction library. And so yes, I would happily recommend it to other readers interested in this subject. Moving on to the graphic fiction now, I read Censor, written, illustrated by Junji Ito. Censor opens with a woman named Kyoko Byakuya coming to the isolated village of Kiyokami, nestled at the foot of Mount Sengoku, a volcano where, after a strange sequence of events, she becomes encased in a cocoon of golden volcanic threads, which causes her to acquire a kind of hypersensory awareness of the universe and its secrets. This additionally all ties back to the past violent death of a Christian missionary named Miguel during the time of the shogunate. But Kyoko isn't actually the tale's main character. This role instead falls to Wataru, a no-name reporter who becomes intrigued and captivated by Kyoko and embroiled with a cult looking to harness the latter's golden volcanic thread-bestowed psychic powers. Censor was my second Junji Ito manga, and what can I say? As with his previously read and loved Uzumaki, I loved the art style in these pages, the deftness with which Junji Ito drew mysterious and horrific things, and just the sheer beauty of some of his full-page illustrations. As to the story itself, Well, I enjoyed its start and the initial stages of its esoteric cult plotline, but unfortunately the manga's overarching plot never really came together in a satisfying way for me. Mostly, it felt like it was rushed to the finish line, that it lacked a necessary measure of setup and breathing space, especially given the fact the thematic and emotional notes I felt the story was trying to reach sadly felt a little trite, and interestingly enough, too optimistic. Not, to be clear, that I require my horror, cosmic or otherwise, be unremittingly grim. I actually tend to dislike grimness for the sake of it in stories in general. It's just that these optimistic or hopeful emotional and thematic notes I encountered in Censor were executed in a way I found unconvincing, and thus ultimately felt unearned to me. So no, Censor did not, in terms of personal impact, commitment to overarching thematic motif, or just overall quality, quite simply, rise to the level of Uzumaki for me, which was like a 9 out of 10. But that doesn't mean it was bad either. It was still an enjoyable and perfectly respectable 7 out of 10 manga in my book that I do not regret reading, or purchasing for that matter, in the slightest. And yeah, rest assured I will absolutely be reading more Junji Ito in the future. Oh yes. Moving on to the fiction literature now, I first read another book for the 2024 Hugo Awards, Start a Villain, written by John Scalzi, and this was my second John Scalzi novel as well. So in Start a Villain you meet and follow Charlie. Charlie used to work as a respected business journalist, and used to be married, but now lives single in the home of his late father with his 2 cats. Remember the cats? They're important. Charlie's finances aren't doing great. His life, really, on the whole, isn't doing great at the minute. But it takes an unexpected turn when, after learning of his estranged but loaded uncle's passing, Charlie is asked by one of his uncle's protégés to host his relative's funerary service. Do this, he is told, and you will become the owner of your father's house and inherit a sizable sum of money from your uncle. What could possibly go wrong? Well, quite a bit as it so happens, because Charlie quickly discovers his uncle made most of his vast fortune working as a supervillain, complete with Volcano Island lair and super intelligent cats. I told you the cats were important. Start a Villain was a rather light-hearted and silly little techno-thriller, adjacent, kind of. Yeah, I'm going with that. Similar-ish in spirit and tone to the Kaiju Preservation Society, though I'd argue the latter went more ham with its sci-fi premise because, well, kaiju and attended parallel universe. Full disclosure here, I also found it funnier given it was more committed to what I like to call nerdy references humor than this one was. That being said, I liked Start a Villain for what it was. I enjoyed the, yes, super intelligent cats and socialist unionizing dolphins. I mean, China Mieville did a similar thing with familiars in Kraken, and I most definitely preferred his version of the concept, but still, Scalzi got me to chuckle with his dolphins, so point. In fact, I chuckled, or smiled, a decent amount reading Start a Villain, so point once again, though no, the story is not one I would necessarily revisit either, and I really think it could have been a short story or novella rather than a short novel. The narrative took a little too long to get going for my taste. The pacing was a little uneven as a result, and I just don't think the way Start a Villain's premise was actually executed, that is, without much depth overall, warranted its length. So, all in all, it was a cute, amusing, and decently entertaining, strong 6 out of 10 read, but no, definitely not on par with the Kaiju Preservation Society, which was a 7.5 out of 10 for me. After that, I read A Sword of Bronze and Ashes, written by Anna Smith Spark. A single point of view story told in third person, it opens up as its main character, a middle-aged mother of 3 daughters named Kanda, comes across a corpse floating down the river running by her cattle pasture. From that point follows a series of harrowing, supernaturally tainted events, told in a present timeline, as Kanda is forced to flee her home with her family to protect it, and is forced to reckon with her progressively revealed past, told in parallel in a past timeline, as Ikandere Thigethin, the greatest warrior that ever was. This one was rather strange, and unfortunately for me, strange in a way I largely found unsatisfying. On a positive note, I definitely think this book's prose stood out. Its author used very lyrical, evocative prose to convincing effect, and more impressively for me at any rate, a somewhat stream of consciousness-infused narrative style that, on its own, for once, largely worked for me. The story's pacing was also pretty even overall, which I liked. I also really enjoyed just how gynocentric the story was, given the kind of story it was. A Sword of Bronze and Ashes is pretty dark, gritty fantasy with significant supernatural, folklore, or mythology-derived horror elements. And yes, I'm aware the author is known for writing grimdark fantasy specifically, though I'm not entirely sure this novel counts as grimdark for me. Of course, your mileage will vary with this. So, given the story's nature, I found the fact its main character was a middle-aged mother of 3 very pleasantly refreshing. Additionally, the author didn't shy away from showing the less savory parts of womanhood, of aging womanhood, chin hairs, bodily pains, heavy periods and all, and how this affected her main character with regards to self-image and self-worth, to some extent at least. Kanda's character work was pretty good overall, though it largely failed when it came to establishing some of her character motivations, specifically, which then impacted the plot's resolution in a way I found, well, yeah, frustrating. The book's broader character work also largely fell by the wayside when it came to the story's secondary and tertiary characters. For the most part, those felt more like sketches, archetypes, plot conveniences, or rather conveniences drawn for the sake of Kanda's character growth, more than fully fleshed characters in their own right. The amount of plot armor some of the characters received was also very inconsistent and felt, as a result, very convenient in a way I also found frustrating. As for the book's world-building and theming, both left me wanting. I didn't get much out of this one with regards to the latter, beyond a couple of threads of exploration on moral redemption and chiefly motherly love. Then with regards to the former, well, this book just didn't deliver much that I could really engage with. I believe this book is, partly at least, sold on the fact its world-building is influenced by Celtic folklore and or mythology. And I could, yes, kind of see it in very subtle ways. But I'm also a mythology nerd and have a very specific interest in and fondness for Celtic stuff. So I'm not sure this would be at all apparent to more casual mythology enthusiasts, and thus worth promoting. More than anything though, this novel had a significant problem in terms of tonal narrative dissonance. It felt, to me, like A Sword of Bronze and Ashes was trying to marry two fairly different and easily dissonant narrative tones. One of epic mythicality, and one of more immediate, intimate, psychological, and familial tragedy, in a way that just didn't work very well. The book's prose was very lyrical, but also fairly dreamlike, in no small part due, I'd wager, to its stream of consciousness inflections. You eventually learn that Kanda is not only much older than a mortal has any right to be, but a kind of demigod is how I understood it. But the narrative doesn't devote enough time to fleshing out the actual nature of her origins, setting or era-wise. Strange, godlike, and demon-like beings are mentioned, but you never really get to understand what their nature truly is. There are also several points in the narrative where you're not entirely sure if what Kanda is experiencing is actually real. There is a lot of shape-shifting as well, of fluidity between states of life and states of death, which, yes, makes sense in a mythological setting, and which, yes, points to Celtic influences if, like me, you know what to look for. But the problem is, I felt like the book ultimately wanted me to focus on the immediate experiences and emotions of a middle-aged mother trying to save her family, and there's nothing for it, none of it meshed together all that well. Strange, non-intuitive combinations like Bear with me. Salt and caramel can sometimes lead to wonderful results. Salted caramel anything is the shit. But this novel was made up of a strange combination that didn't, ultimately for me, taste all that good. It's not that it tasted bad as such either, exactly. It had rather an interesting taste, but I probably wouldn't order that specific flavor combination again, if you catch my drift. Which means I don't regret picking this one up since it was memorable in its own way, but for me, it was a 6 too soft 6.5 out of 10 read, and thus only worth reading once. After that, I read, also for the 2024 Hugo Awards, Martha Wells' Witch King, which centers on Kai, short for Kaisteron, a demon prince who for decades has been inhabiting a few different human bodies and takes place in a secondary fantasy world that has been devastated by a continent-wide war, where various long to very long-lived and magic-wielding races or ethnic groups, such as witches, blessed immortals, and demons, live in a precarious state of balance. It is told in first person, from Kai's sole point of view, and through two different timelines. A present one, in which Kai wakes up from a magic coma, then tries to make, well, sense of lost time, and an accompanying political intrigue, and a past timeline in which unfolds Kai's personal backstory, as well as some of his homeland's history, especially as it pertains to the Great War it went through decades before the present timeline. I appreciated Martha Wells' prose and descriptions, which I found overall very evocative and effective in making her world come to life and feel real. The world of Witch King, such as it was portrayed, did not lack for texture, sounds, smells, or colors, and the author managed to provide several different, yet more or less equally compelling sketches of her various ethnic groups or humanoid races. Witch King's world-building, or the glimpses I got of it at any rate, was, for its part, pleasantly tantalizing. I was a big fan of the book's informative world-building epigraphs, but I mean, I always liked that, so... And I loved the creative way the author reinterpreted classic supernatural figures, well, such as those of the witch, or demon, or even arguably those of angels, though it must be said, I think the world-building as a whole could have been fleshed out a lot more than it actually was. In terms of theming, I'll concede there were, yes, a couple of threads here on personal identity given Kai's body hopping, and cultural identity given the atrocious genocidal war the story referenced, and only briefly featured directly. But these threads didn't run particularly deep either, nor were they compellingly developed all that much. Most of the characters were, yes, impassioned by need and desire for justice and the creation of a better world, but this related aspect of the book's theming also felt rather superficial overall. Which brings me to character work. Kai received a good amount of character development as the story's protagonist, but the character work flagged a little when it came to the tale's secondary players. Worse, however, was the portrayal of its character relationships. These were mostly fine in the book's present timeline, but the author then failed to properly establish the reasons why her core cast became entangled in the first place in her past timeline. There was a glaring lack of necessary character motivations, and it felt to me as if the present timeline's characters had only become fast friends or partners in the past because the plot, or rather present timeline, needed them to be because it just said so. This issue was compounded by the fact I never got a solid grasp on the passage of time in the story. A few chronological markers would have been very helpful here. As it stands, the best I could do was surmise the story spanned several decades, and that's what I just said, but the fact is I'm not even entirely sure of that. Finally, the fact is I was ultimately disappointed by the story itself, and frustrated by its conclusion. The plot, in essence, never really came together for me. Its threads were ultimately stretched a little too thinly across its two different timelines. I feel the main problem here was one of page count management, because I actually think this story could have benefited from an increase in its length, rare as that is. Witch King really could have been a chunkier novel, or even a duology, or, conversely, it could have been downsized to a more tightly focused novella, perhaps. things were just too scattered here, which is a shame because I really did thoroughly enjoy Wells' world building, specifically here, or I mean, the elements of it I got. So, all in all, this novel was decent to good. It was a 6.5 to 7 out of 10 for me, and I wouldn't not recommend it, but it also definitely suffered from a certain case of unrealized potentiality. That being said, the overarching feeling of competently delivered secondary world fantasy storytelling, I know what I mean here, it left me with actually makes me want to read Martha Wells' books of the Raksura series, very specifically, in the future, even more now, so that's definitely a positive. As an additional FYI though, I have absolutely zero interest in reading the Murderbot Diaries. Finally, in June, I read Patrick Rothfuss's The Narrow Road Between Desires, a Kingkiller Chronicles novella that follows a day in the life of Bast, Ulda Kvoth's charming but rather mysterious fae friend, apprentice, and employee. More specifically, this tale offers the reader a glimpse into the daily deals Bast strikes with the local children, and the often conflicting desires, yes, nestled in his heart of hearts, that move and motivate him to do what he does. Now, since I love the main novels of the Kingkiller Chronicles and the series' first companion novella, The Slow Regard of Silent Things, both of which I first read last year, I am very glad to say I thoroughly enjoyed the second companion novella as well. It was a pleasure to experience Mr. Rothfuss's prose again, and to learn a few crumbs of new, or at least new to me, lore, because I mean, I've never read The Lightning Tree, about Tamarant's Feyen and their magic. I also quite simply enjoyed getting a closer look at Bast, and found his character pretty interesting overall. More than that, however, I really appreciated the subtle and respectful way abuse and related trauma were portrayed in this book, and the quiet but very believable compassion Bast was shown to express in response to both. And also in a way that felt very fairy-like. I mean, in reference to real-world fairy folklore, that was done very, very well, so point to Rothfuss for that as well. But so yes, to me it's just so heartening to see the Kingkiller Chronicles' genuine valuing of kindness, compassion, and gentleness of spirit hold true across all of the series-related tales. I think it's so lovely. So, given all that, The Narrow Road Between Desires was, for me, a very solid 7.5 out of 10 read. Yay! As such, and regardless of the controversy surrounding this specific publication, I would personally warmly and confidently recommend this novella to any fan of the Kingkiller Chronicles who has not yet read it. In June, I also watched, with my partner, the first and or second seasons of a few TV shows ranging from full-on fantasy to milder degrees of unrealism. I will start with the first season of Delicious in Dungeon, an anime that centers on what I'll call D&D, so Dungeons and Dragons style questing, and cooking recipes with monster parts. This premise is rather silly, yes, I'll admit, but this show actually exceeded both my and my partner's expectations. Mostly, it surprised me with the genuine thought that went into its world building, a lot of which pulls from real-world fantastical creatures folklore and riffs off of classical fantasy tropes in creative ways, and the way its plot progressively grew in complexity. I also just really enjoyed its party of main characters, and the plentiful heart and humor it featured. The opening credits song for the second part of the first season was also an absolute bop. And I'm sad we won't be getting any more of it going forward. Because yes, I'm absolutely going to keep watching this one. So far, I'd say it sits at like, yeah, a tentative 7.5 out of 10 for me. Then my partner and I watched all of the currently released episodes of both Hazbin Hotel and Helluva Boss, two animated shows created by the same person, and which take place in the same universe, or rather version of hell, and heaven technically, since both work with a reinterpretation of biblical mythology and related supernatural imagery. Hazbin Hotel, more specifically, follows Charlie, the daughter of Lucifer and Lilith, and thus Princess of Hell, and her friends as they try and get the project to redeem sinners' souls so they can potentially be transferred to heaven off the ground. However, Boss, for its part, focuses on a group of imps and a hellhound who work as contract killers for recently deceased human souls looking to exact revenge on the people who fucked them over in life. They also interact with various other demons, or archdemons, such as Beelzebub, Mammon, or Stolas the Owl, which, super cool and fun real-life occultism fact, is an actual demon listed in the 17th century Lesser Key of Solomon. You're welcome. Both of these shows also technically qualify as musicals, though I personally found the singing was slightly more prevalent in Hazbin Hotel. Now, I'm actually not a fan of musicals at all. I'm not sure why, but singing in movies or TV shows makes me cringe really freaking hard as a general rule. That being said, I really didn't mind it so much in these two shows, as most of the songs served a well-executed plot progressing function. That definitely helped. I absolutely loved the show's art style. It's highly distinctive, very colorful, and clever in the way it uses symbols, animal imagery, lots of that, or biblical, mythological reference markers. Hazbin Hotel specifically also rocks, at least in part, a roaring 20s aesthetic I really liked, and Helluva Boss's characters, for their part, often displayed a, to me, very visually pleasing animal fluidity in their movements. It tickled my brain in a really good way. Plot and pacing-wise, I think I preferred Helluva Boss a little more. Or I mean, I prefer it a little more so far. Hazbin Hotel's first season just felt a bit too dense for my taste. It needed more room to breathe and establish its pretty high stakes, whereas this was not at all a concern with Helluva Boss's more immediate, character drama-focused storytelling. But I loved both world-building and aesthetic signature as a whole. The, what I'll call cute creepy factor reminded me of the game Cult of the Lamb, which I've played a fair bit of. The remixing of biblical and perhaps pagan? We'll see about that, I guess. Mythology reminded me of American Gods a little. Brahms' Lost Gods, which I read 2 years ago now. And then, given the kind of humor those shows play with, my beloved Supernatural as well, to some extent. So given this rather personally compelling mix, both of these shows so far float between a 6 to 6.5 and 7 out of 10 for me, and I'm also here definitely looking forward to watching more of them. I'm also going to mention Adult Swim's Smiling Friends, which is a short animation series, so by that I mean that each episode runs for about 10 minutes on average, about a company, kind of, that aims to provide cheering up services to its clients. Its main characters are two dudes named Pim and Charlie, lots of Charlies in this video for some reason, with the former being the more optimistic and enthusiastic type, always seeing the best in people and situations, and the latter being the more realistic and, well, jaded to cynical type. It's not fantasy or sci-fi in the traditional sense, but I mean, Pim and Charlie variously encounter wizards, monsters, aliens, incarnated spam emails, if that's what that was, and a Mr. Frog, who is literally a giant sentient frogman, so like, yeah. Though really, all of that's because Smiling Friends is absurdist comedy in the purest sense of the concept. It's just so freaking weird and unhinged, but in a way that tickles my brain just right, and I honestly can't explain it further than that. If it vaguely sounds appealing to you, I'd say give it a go. For my part, I give it a cotton candy acid trip out of 10 rating. I'll quickly add that I also started watching the second season of House of the Dragon as well, and that I'm still thoroughly enjoying it. It continues to be a solidly good adaptation of Fire and Blood, or rather the Dance of the Dragons, and I'll take it. Though, I do still hate the reference to the Song of Ice and Fire prophecy shtick. It wasn't necessary in Season 1, it's unnecessary in Season 2, and I ardently wish they hadn't slipped it in, because I remain convinced they did this for the wrong reason. But that's the only major false note. So far, so fine, I can live with it. That will be all for this June reading wrap-up. In the coming month of July, I will be tackling the first 3 books in the Malazan Book of the Fallen series. Wish me luck and enjoyment there. And in the month of August, and probably during the first half of the month of September, I will be rereading the Harry Potter series. I will, as a reminder, also be going to Worldcon in Glasgow, then Ireland to spend the month with my partner. As such, I've decided to put my reading wrap-up videos on hold until the month of September. I do, however, plan on doing a reading vlog of sorts for my Malazan read-through, or, you know, its first part at any rate, which I will try and get done and uploaded before I leave for Glasgow. And then I might do the same, so a vlog of sorts, for Worldcon itself, or I mean, little clips at least, and my reread of the Harry Potter books, but I can't promise anything there. We'll see how I feel about it then. And on that very final note, I hope you all had an as lovely as possible month of June, reading and everything else-wise. I hope you all have a lovely day, evening, or whichever time of day you prefer. Please do take good care of yourselves. Thank you for the continued support, and I shall see you all at a point in the not-too-distant future in the next video, but until then, bye-bye.